trucks can't get up there. Everything will burn.
I warned you! Your rocks are blocking the only road that could save them.
The morning of Monday, the 12th of September began, not with the ancient whispering silence of the ponderosa pines, but with a low mechanical rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of Caleb Croft's ancestral cabin. Caleb did not startle. At 62, with 3 decades of service as a federal fire warden in the rugged valleys of western Colorado, his nervous system was calibrated to the slow, heavy rhythms of the mountains. He was a man built like the trees he had protected, tall, knotty, and seasoned by years of high-altitude sun and freezing winds. He stood by the cast-iron stove, slowly swirling a copper mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise into the cold, dry air. Outside, the yellowing aspen leaves trembled not from the wind, but from the deep rhythmic thrum of 3 heavy tri-axle dump trucks grinding their gears as they climbed the steep grade of Croft Ridge. Caleb set his mug down on the seasoned oak counter, picked up his old battered Nikon digital camera, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp electrical scent of early autumn. He walked down the steps, his worn leather boots sinking softly into the thick carpet of dry pine needles that covered his 40-acre homestead. At the eastern boundary of his land lay the Pine Needle Trail, known on federal forestry maps as Fire Lane 7. For over a century, it had been a simple, unpaved road of hard-packed earth and reddish pine needles wide enough for a heavy forestry vehicle and bordered by towering ancient pines. But today, the quiet trail was a construction zone. Priscilla Davenport stood on the high bank overlooking the trail, looking like an exotic bird entirely out of place in the wilderness. She wore an expensive cream-colored cashmere wrap that she constantly adjusted, and her manicured fingers held a sleek iPad propped up in a gold-plated case. Behind her lay Blackwood Glen, a newly minted enclave of $18 million glass and steel eco-cabins that had sprouted like invasive weeds along the lower ridge. "Back it up. Yes, right there. Dump it." Priscilla's high-pitched nasal voice cut through the mountain air like a rusty saw. The lead dump truck, a massive Kenworth, painted a glossy corporate blue, hissed its air brakes. The metal tailgate swung open with a deafening clang that echoed off the granite cliffs of Croft Ridge. Then came the sound that Caleb would remember as the opening chord of the entire drama, the terrifying metallic roar of 80 tons of raw granite hocks sliding out of the steel truck bed. The massive stones, some the size of old steamer trunks, cascaded down onto the Pine Needle Trail. They smashed into the soft earth, crushing the delicate ferns, tearing the roots of the ancient ponderosas, and sending up a choking cloud of gray granite dust that turned the morning sun into a pale, sickly disk. The ground shuddered violently under Caleb's boots. "Perfect." Priscilla clapped her hands, her diamonds catching the dusty sunlight. "Absolutely gorgeous. It looks so organic." Caleb walked calmly to the boundary line, stopping just on his side of the property marker. He raised the Nikon and took 3 quick photos of the freshly dumped monoliths, the truck license plates, and Priscilla's ecstatic expression. "Good morning, Priscilla." Caleb said, his voice a low, dry gravel growl that didn't need to be loud to carry over the idling diesel engines. "I see you've brought some rocks." Priscilla turned her face, instantly tightening into a mask of polite suburban hostility. "Oh, Caleb, I didn't see you standing there in your flannel." "Yes, we did. The Blackwood Glen Board of Directors has officially commenced our Winter Scenic Harmony initiative. We are converting this rather unsightly dirt ditch into a Japanese-inspired dry riverbed garden. It's a professional design. It's going to raise all of our property values." "It's not an unsightly dirt ditch, Priscilla," Caleb said, pointing with his camera toward the crushed path. "It is HOA, so Bay Fire Lane 7. It is a designated Class 1 federal fire corridor. It is the only road in a 5-mile radius with a grade shallow enough and a bed wide enough to support a 25-ton Type 1 structural fire engine, coming up from the state highway to the Suandoy, the steep hill behind your glass houses." Priscilla let out a sharp, patronizing laugh, adjusting her cashmere wrap with a theatrical flick of her wrist. "Caleb, please. We have been through this. The board has spent $300,000 on a state-of-the-art, smart-connected, high-pressure fire suppression system. We have automated pop-up copper sprinklers lining our entire perimeter. We do not need heavy, dirty diesel-spewing trucks rumbling past our bedroom windows, tracking mud over our pristine asphalt. The era of the rustic country plow is over. This is a private easement, and we have every legal right to beautify it. The easement on this trail was granted to the county and adjacent landowners in 1924. Priscilla, Caleb replied, his voice devoid of anger, carrying only the flat, terrifying weight of a man who spent his life studying forest fire dynamics. It was granted with one ironclad condition. It must remain an unobstructed, passable corridor for emergency services. If you block this path, you are cutting off your only escape route and the only way a crew can get water to your ridge when the forest decides to burn. The forest isn't going to burn, Caleb. We have an app that monitors soil moisture, Priscilla said, tapping her iPad screen with a French-tipped nail. And even if it did, our smart sprinklers would handle it. Furthermore, the board has officially issued a citation against your property for visual pollution. Your unpainted wooden tool shed is visible from our 8th hole tee box. We've assessed a $500 daily fine until you paint it a certified shade of Blackwood beige. We suggest you focus on your own backyard and let us handle ours. Caleb looked at the massive mound of granite. He looked at the second truck, which was already maneuvering into place to dump another 80 tons of rock. He looked at Priscilla's smug, triumphant smile. He realized with a quiet, chilling clarity that there was a level of wealth-induced stupidity that was entirely impervious to logic, physics, or common sense. It was a disease that could only be cured by the very elements they sought to exclude. I will put my warnings in writing, Priscilla, Caleb said quietly. For the record, write whatever you want, old man. She smirked, turning her back to him to signal the next truck. But the rocks are staying. Blackwood Glen does not compromise on aesthetics. Caleb turned and walked back to his cabin, the heavy roar of the second rock dump rumming behind him, shaking the dry pine needles from the trees like gray rain. To understand the sheer depth of Priscilla Davenport's folly, one had to understand the plumbing of Croft Ridge. For 3 generations, the Croft family had managed the water rights of the Upper Valley. In 1924, Caleb's grandfather, Silas Croft, had signed a mutual-use water agreement with the original ranchers of the Lower Basin. Underneath the Pine Needle Trail, buried exactly 4 feet deep in the rocky soil, lay a 12-inch clay-sealed, low-pressure steel water main. This pipe fed gravity-driven, pristine spring water from Croft Lake, a deep spring-fed tarn on Caleb's property down to the lower valley. When the developers built Blackwood Glen, they didn't bother digging their own deep wells. Instead, they quietly negotiated an agreement with Caleb's late father to tap into this ancient gravity line. They used it to fill their ornamental lakes, feed their cascading waterfalls, and supply the massive pumps of their state-of-the-art $1-million fire suppression system. The pipe ran directly under the very trail that Priscilla was currently chalking with granite. Caleb sat in his study, the walls lined with topographical maps, forestry certificates, and old hand-drawn land deeds. Across from him sat Arthur Vance, a retired land use attorney and Caleb's lifelong friend. Arthur was a man who appreciated 2 things above all else: 20-year-old single malt whiskey and the slow, agonizing destruction of arrogant developers through the meticulous application of contract law. Arthur read through the aesthetic citation that the HOA had sent Caleb, a thin, sardonic smile playing on his lips. "They really are marvelous, aren't they?" Arthur murmured, swirling his glass. Priscilla and her little committee. They believe that because they have a high-priced legal firm in Denver on retainer, they have successfully repealed the laws of property rights and gravity. "She's dumping another 3 loads tomorrow, Arthur," Caleb said, staring out the window at the dark silhouette of the ridge. "By Wednesday, there will be 200 dam and 50 tons of raw granite sitting on top of the old clay water main. That pipe was laid in 1954. It's cast iron and clay seal. It was designed to withstand the weight of a truck passing over it, not the static, crushing weight of a permanent rock fortress." "Then we let them," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "We do not fight them, Caleb. If you file for an injunction, their lawyers will tie you up in court for 3 years, deplete your savings, and claim you are just a bitter old nimby blocking progress. No, we do not fight. We comply. But we comply on our terms." For the next 4 hours, the 2 men drafted a document. It was a masterpiece of legal martial arts designed to use the HOA's own momentum to throw them over the cliff. They titled it, "The Croft Blackwood Joint Agreement of Aesthetic Compliance and Infrastructure Liability Waiver." The document was written in a tone of meek surrender. It stated that Caleb Croft, wishing to avoid costly litigation and live in harmony with his distinguished neighbors, agreed to waive his objections to the beautification of Fire Lane 7. He would allow the HOA to place their rock gardens directly over his easement. In exchange for this generous concession, the HOA would 1. Rescind the $500 daily fine for Caleb's wooden shed immediately and permanently. 2. Formally accept 100% ownership, maintenance, and structural responsibility for the surface and subsurface of the Pine Needle Trail easement area. 3. Explicitly assume all civil, financial, and environmental liabilities for any infrastructure failures, water flow disruptions, blockages, or emergency access limitations that might result from their landscape modifications. "It's beautiful," Arthur whispered, tapping the paper. "It reads like a white flag." Priscilla will see the words "Caleb Croft agrees to waive objections," and her brain will short-circuit with victory. She won't even show this to her Denver lawyers. She'll sign it immediately just so she can boast to the board that she broke the stubborn old forest warden. Arthur was right. On Friday afternoon, Caleb walked into the timber-framed, high-ceilinged clubhouse of Blackwood Glen. Priscilla was there presiding over a committee meeting about the appropriate shade of green for the tennis court windbreaks. Caleb quietly slid the document across the polished mahogany table. "I've brought the agreement, Priscilla. I don't want to fight anymore. You can keep your rocks. Just sign this and we'll call it even on the fines." Priscilla's eyes lit up with a flash of pure, unchecked triumph. She snatched up the paper, her eyes skimming the first page. "Well, Caleb, I'm glad you've finally seen reason. It's about community standards after all. We can't have old-fashioned dirt roads in a world-class development." Without reading past page 2, and certainly without looking at the dense legal boilerplate on page 4 regarding subsurface infrastructure and emergency access liabilities, Priscilla Davenport signed the document with a heavy gold-plated Montblanc pen. She stamped it with the official gold leaf seal of the Blackwood Glen Homeowners Association. "There," she said, sliding the copy back to him with a smug, dismissive wave. "The trucks will finish dumping the granite tomorrow morning. Have a nice weekend, Caleb." "You too, Priscilla," Caleb said, folding the document carefully and placing it in his breast pocket. "You too." The next morning, the remaining dump trucks arrived. Another 90 tons of granite crashed down onto the trail, compacting the earth with a terrifying heavy thrum. But beneath the surface, deep in the dark, cold earth, the laws of physics were already at work. The massive static load of 250 tons of unyielding granite pressed down on the dry, shifting soil. The ancient, unreinforced 1954 clay-sealed pipe, already brittle with age, groaned under the immense weight, with a dull, wet, subterranean thud that no one on the surface could hear. The main pipeline cracked, then buckled, and finally collapsed inward, completely choking the flow of gravity-fed water. 10 minutes later, in his pump house on the high ridge, Caleb watched the pressure gauge on his main water line drop to 0. He walked over to the heavy cast-iron shutoff wheel, the main gate valve that fed the gravity line down to Blackwood Glen. With slow, deliberate movements, Caleb turned the heavy wheel clockwise, sealing the valve tight. He padlocked the wheel with a heavy brass master lock, slipped the key into his pocket, and went back to his cabin to make a fresh pot of coffee. The first sign of trouble for Blackwood Glen came on Tuesday morning when the manicured greens of the community's signature golf course began to turn a sickly yellow-brown. By Thursday, the million-dollar cascading waterfalls at the entrance had dried up to a stagnant, muddy trickle. More importantly, the digital sensors in their automated fire suppression system began to flash amber, indicating a complete loss of water pressure in their primary emergency line. Priscilla Davenport did not investigate the plumbing. She did what she always did when reality refused to comply with her wishes. She called her lawyers and filed an emergency lawsuit. The litigation took place in the small wood-paneled courtroom of the Blackwood County Courthouse. The room smelled of old paper floor wax and the dry, bitter scent of bureaucratic despair. At the bench sat Judge Walter Vance, a no-nonsense third-generation mountain judge with a face like a carved cliffside and a reputation for treating arrogant city lawyers like invasive weeds. The HOA had hired a prestigious Denver law firm represented by a sharp, fast-talking young attorney named Harrison Cole. Cole stood before the bench in a $3,000 suit, gesturing dramatically toward Caleb Croft, who sat quietly at the defense table in a clean pressed flannel shirt and worn jeans, with Arthur Vance sitting calmly beside him. "Your Honor," Cole's voice echoed off the oak walls, "this is a clear, malicious act of bad faith sabotage. The defendant, Caleb Croft, has intentionally cut off the water supply to Blackwood Glen. This is a community of 72 premium residential homes. They are currently without irrigation. Their ornamental lakes are turning into mosquito-breeding swamps, and most critically, their state-of-the-art fire suppression system is completely dry. He is holding our community hostage over a petty neighbor dispute." Judge Vance leaned forward, his heavy gray eyebrows knitting together. He looked down at Caleb. Mr. Croft, is this true? Have you shut off the water to the plaintiff's subdivision? Caleb stood up slowly, his voice steady, carrying the natural authority of a man who had spent his life dealing with federal mandates. I did turn the main gate valve at my reservoir, Your Honor, but I did not do it out of malice. I did it to prevent a catastrophic environmental and physical disaster on my property. Harrison Cole let out a loud theatrical scoff. Oh, please, a disaster. You turned a valve to get back at my client because she improved the aesthetics of a dirt road. If I may, Your Honor, Arthur Vance stood up, opening a manila folder on the defense table. We would like to enter 3 documents into the record. The first is a certified geotechnical and engineering report from the State Department of Natural Resources conducted yesterday afternoon. Arthur handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. As Your Honor can see from the report, Arthur continued, the plaintiff, the Blackwood Glen HOA, recently dumped 250 tons of heavy granite hocks directly on top of the ancient gravity water main running through the Pine Needle Trail easement. The static pressure of that massive, unyielding stone pile caused a complete structural collapse of the clay-sealed cast iron pipe buried underneath. When the pipe collapsed, spring water began to erupt underground at a rate of 400 gallons a minute, rapidly eroding the subterranean soil. If Mr. Croft had not turned off the main valve, the entire eastern slope of Croft Ridge would have suffered a massive landslide, threatening not only his land, but the very homes below. Harrison Cole's face paled slightly, but he quickly recovered his footing. Your Honor, even if that is true, Mr. Croft has an easement obligation to maintain that water line. We demand an immediate emergency injunction ordering him to turn the water back on, and we will handle the repairs later. We would love to do that, Mr. Cole. Arthur Vance said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. But that brings us to our second document, the Croft-Blackwood Joint Agreement of Aesthetic Compliance and Infrastructure Liability Waiver, signed and sealed by the president of the HOA, Priscilla Davenport, just last week. Judge Vance adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the document. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch of amusement appeared at the corner of his mouth. According to this signed agreement, Judge Vance read aloud, his voice rich with dry judicial irony. The HOA has formally assumed 100% ownership, maintenance, and structural responsibility for the Pine Needle Trail easement area. Furthermore, they have explicitly waived all claims against Mr. Croft and accepted full liability for any infrastructure failures, blockages, or water flow disruptions resulting from their beautification project. Your Honor, that is an administrative waiver. Cole stammered, his polished Denver demeanor cracking. It was signed without a full understanding of the engineering implications. Then your client should have hired an engineer instead of a landscaper. Mr. Cole, Judge Vance said, his voice dropping to a cold, authoritative rumble. The contract is clear, valid, and signed under seal. The HOA owns the surface, the rocks, and the liability. Mr. Croft turned off the water to prevent a landslide on his own property caused by your client's crushed infrastructure. He was not only legally permitted to do so under this agreement, he was ecologically obligated to. But the fire system, Cole cried out, his voice rising in desperation. The community is unprotected. If a fire starts, then I suggest, Judge Vance interrupted, tapping his gavel with a sharp, decisive clack, that your client get some heavy equipment up to that ridge and move those rocks to repair their pipe. But until they do this, court will not issue any injunction. Mr. Croft is under no legal obligation to restore water flow to a pipe that your client crushed and currently owns. Case dismissed. And Mr. Cole, tell your client that in this county we respect the laws of contract and the laws of gravity. Priscilla Davenport, sitting in the front row of the gallery, let out a soft, horrified gasp. She looked at Caleb, but Caleb was already packing his papers into his leather briefcase, not even sparing her a glance. The courthouse itself was a relic of an era when justice was carved from the same hard granite as the mountains. Built in 1892, its heavy stone facade had weathered 3 distinct mining booms, 2 depressions in the gradual transformation of the county from a rugged frontier of cattle ranchers and timbermen into a playground for the urban elite. Its tall, arched windows looked out over a landscape that was rapidly being carved into multi-million-dollar subdivisions, but inside the high-ceilinged courtroom remained stubbornly resistant to change. The floorboards, polished to a dark sheen by decades of linseed oil, creaked under the weight of modern briefcases with the same heavy, rhythmic groan they had once made under the muddy boots of gold miners. Judge Walter Vance presided from a bench of hand-carved Colorado walnut, a massive structure that made him look like a physical extension of the law itself. He was a man who had little patience for the semantic gymnastics of modern litigation. To Judge Vance, the law was not a flexible theoretical playground for high-priced city lawyers, but a practical set of rules designed to keep neighbors from shooting each other over fence lines. Harrison Cole, the young Denver attorney representing the Blackwood Glen HOA, did not understand this. He stood before the bench in his tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the slick, unearned confidence of a man who believed that a sufficiently complex combination of legal buzzwords could override any physical reality. He gestured grandly toward Caleb Croft, trying to paint him as a bitter backward survivalist who was actively endangering the lives of 80 wealthy tax-paying families. Your Honor, Cole pleaded, his voice dripping with theatrical concern, this is not merely a dispute over a dirt road. This is a matter of public safety. The defendant is stubbornly withholding a vital resource, water, from a community that is completely defenseless without it. He is using an ancient, obsolete water agreement as a weapon to punish our residents for simply wanting to improve the aesthetic value of their neighborhood. It is a clear-cut case of malicious obstruction. Judge Vance leaned forward, his heavy gray eyebrows knitting together in a way that made Harrison Cole's confident smile falter slightly. Mr. Cole, the judge said, his voice a slow, dry rumble that filled the courtroom. This court is well aware of the aesthetic values of Blackwood Glen. I have seen the brochures. But let us talk about the water line. The report from the State Department of Natural Resources indicates that the pipe under the trail is crushed. If Mr. Croft were to open the main gate valve right now, as you are demanding, where exactly would that spring water go? Well, it would flow into the system, Your Honor, Cole stammered, shifting his weight. Our engineers would monitor it. No, Mr. Cole, it would not, Judge Vance interrupted, tapping his finger on the mahogany bench. It would flow directly into the fractured bedrock underneath the pine needle trail at a rate of 400 gallons a minute. It would saturate the unstable clay layers of the eastern slope. Within 48 hours, the entire hillside would liquefy, sending 50,000 cubic yards of mud and granite hawks sliding straight down into the master bedrooms of your premium residential enclave. Now tell me, does your firm specialize in landslide defense, or are you hoping to sue the mud for trespassing? A quiet, smothered chuckle came from Arthur Vance at the defense table. Sitting in the front row of the gallery, Priscilla Davenport's face underwent a dramatic transformation. The smug, triumphant expression she had worn when she walked into the courthouse began to dissolve, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of dawning panic. She clutched her designer leather handbag against her chest like a life preserver in a rising tide. For the first time, she was realizing that the gold-plated clipboard, the administrative bylaws, and the high society connections she had relied upon for decades were utterly useless in a room where the only currency was hard evidence and the unyielding laws of nature. She looked at Caleb, hoping to find some trace of anger, some opening she could exploit. But Caleb's face remained completely smooth, a calm granite surface that reflected nothing but the cold, patient reality of the mountain itself. August in the high country of Colorado is a month of dry, crackling tension. The mountain air, usually so fresh, becomes thin, hot, and heavy with the scent of dry pine needles and parched earth. The sky is often a brilliant, cruel blue, devoid of rain clouds, but filled with dry, static heat that makes the hair on your arms stand up. By the 25th of August, the Thunglung, the valley, had not seen a single drop of rain in 78 days. The relative humidity had dropped to a terrifying 4%. The massive ponderosa pines and white oaks that lined the boundary between Croft Ridge and Blackwood Glen were no longer living trees. They were standing columns of volatile pitch and dry cellulose. Caleb stood on his porch holding a handheld weather monitor. The wind was gusting from the southwest at 45 miles an hour, bringing hot, dry air up from the desert. He looked up at the sky. A dark, bruised line of clouds was forming over the western peaks. There was no moisture in those clouds, only the terrifying threat of dry lightning. Caleb didn't need to look at his monitors to know what had happened. A single bolt of dry lightning had struck the old oil-cooled transformer on the western ridge of the National Forest, just 2 miles upwind from Croft Ridge. The superheated oil had exploded, spraying white-hot shrapnel into the parched pine stand below. Within 10 minutes, the fire was crowning. A crown fire is the most terrifying phenomenon in the natural world. It does not crawl along the forest floor. It leaps from treetop to treetop, driven by the wind, creating its own weather system. It roars like a fleet of freight trains, throwing out embers that ignite new fires miles ahead of the main front. Inside the gated community of Blackwood Glen, the high-pressure alarms began to scream. Priscilla Davenport ran out onto her terrace, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was already thick with choking yellow-gray smoke, and the sky had turned a hellish bruised orange. She ran to her control panel and hit the emergency override to activate the automated $1 million sprinkler system. Nothing happened. The copper sprinkler heads popped up from the manicured lawns, let out a pathetic dry hiss of escaping air, and then fell silent. The pipes under the Pine Needle Trail were still crushed. The main water valve from Caleb's reservoir was still padlocked shut. There was no water. There was only the dry, hot wind. 911, please, we need help. Priscilla screamed into her phone, her voice cracking with terror. The fire is coming down the ridge. Our sprinklers aren't working. Send the trucks. The main road is blocked, ma'am. The dispatcher's voice was barely audible over the static and the roar of the wind. A burning high-voltage transmission tower has collapsed across Blackwood Boulevard. There are live wires everywhere. The utility crews can't clear it yet. The fire department is sending Engine 3, but they have to use the emergency access road, Fire Lane 7. No! Priscilla shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch of pure, unadulterated horror. No, they can't. It's blocked. What do you mean blocked, ma'am? That's a federal fire corridor. But Priscilla had already hung up. She ran toward her car, but the thick smoke was already rolling down the driveway, making it impossible to see. She could hear the terrifying deep roar of the fire coming over the ridge, a sound like 1,000 jet engines. At that moment, Caleb Croft was standing at the boundary of his property, wearing his old yellow Nomex Wildland fire jacket and his leather gloves. He could see the headlights of Engine 3, a massive 25-ton four-wheel drive structural fire truck, grinding up the steep dirt trail of Croft Ridge. But as the massive truck rounded the bend leading to the Pine Needle Trail, its brakes squealed in desperation. The truck came to a sudden grinding halt just 50 feet from the boundary line. Before them sat the 250 tons of granite hawks, forming an impassable rugged barrier of stone. Chief Harris. What the hell is this, Croft? What is this wall doing on the fire lane? Caleb ran to the driver's side window. The HOA dumped at Harris. They claimed the road was an aesthetic nuisance. They signed a waiver taking full ownership and liability of the easement. We can't get over this, Harris roared, his face red with frustration and fear as he looked at the wall of fire crowning just half a mile away. We've got 4 rookie firefighters on Engine 3, and the fire is wrapping around our flank. If we don't get through to the Suindoy, the clearing behind those houses, we're going to get overrun. We need to dump our water and run, or we're going to die right here. Priscilla Davenport came scrambling through the brush, her clothes torn, her face blackened by soot, sobbing hysterically. She threw herself against Caleb's yellow jacket. Caleb, please use your machine, use your tractor to move the rocks. My house, my beautiful house is going to burn. Those boys are going to die. Please, Caleb. Caleb looked at the massive mound of granite. Even with his heavy Caterpillar D8 bulldozer moving 250 tons of interlocking raw granite hawks would take at least 3 hours. They didn't have 3 hours. They had less than 7 minutes before the fire front hit the ridge. He looked at the 4 young, terrified faces of the rookie firefighters inside the cab of Engine 3. They were barely 20 years old. They had families. They had lives. Caleb made his decision. It was a choice that would tear a hole in his own heart, but it was the only choice a true warden could make. Harris! Caleb yelled over the roar of the approaching firestorm. Don't touch the rocks. You'll roll the truck, trying to clear them back up 50 yards. Now, Caleb turned and ran toward his barn. He climbed into the high steel cab of his massive 70-ton Caterpillar D8 bulldozer. He threw the glow plug switch, pumped the throttle, and hit the ignition. Caleb engaged the heavy steel tracks. He swung the massive high-tensile steel blade low. He didn't steer toward the granite rocks of the HOA. He steered the massive machine toward his own land, toward the magnificent ancient grove of white oaks and sedgegrass that his grandfather had planted in 1895. The grove was Caleb's pride and joy. It was his sanctuary, but today it had to die so that men could live. Caleb pushed the throttle to maximum. The D8 groaned its tracks, biting deep into the dry earth as it slammed into the first 100-year-old oak. With relentless, brutal force, Caleb drove the bulldozer straight through his own forest, tearing down his beloved trees, crushing his organic herb gardens, and carving a wide, raw dirt firebreak through his own land. He worked with the frantic, precise desperation of an expert, throwing the massive machine forward, clearing a 12-foot wide path of bare mineral soil that bypassed the HOA's rock barrier entirely. Within 5 minutes, he had cleared a rough, dusty bypass road running through his own destroyed property, connecting the lower trail directly to the Suandoi behind the subdivision. "Harris," Caleb roared over his radio, "go take the bypass, drive through my grove." Engine 3 didn't hesitate. The massive red truck roared forward, its heavy tires tearing through the fresh dirt, bypassing the granite fortress of Blackwood Glen and reaching the clearing behind the villas. The 4 young firefighters immediately began deploying their hoses, using the last of their truck's water to create a defensive wet line around their own vehicle and the escape path. But they had no water to spare for the houses. The main pipe was still dry. Caleb parked the D8, climbed down from the cab, and stood on his side of the freshly carved firebreak. He watched as the wall of fire, driven by 45-mile-an-hour winds, hit the eastern ridge. The fire reached the boundary of Blackwood Glen. It hit the dry, decorative wooden fences. It hit the dry, imported Japanese ornamental trees that Priscilla had planted to replace the ugly native vegetation. And then it hit Priscilla Davenport's multi-million-dollar glass and steel mansion. Without water to feed the automated sprinklers, the house was nothing but a fragile greenhouse filled with highly combustible luxury furniture. Within minutes, the intense radiant heat shattered the massive glass panels. The hot wind pushed the embers inside, and the entire structure exploded into a towering column of white-hot flame. Caleb stood next to the roaring engine of his bulldozer, his face illuminated by the terrible orange glow of the destruction. Next to him, Priscilla Davenport sat in the dirt, her hands covering her face, watching her $3 million dream turn into a pile of white glowing ash. The laws of physics had arrived, and they had left no survivors. The weather in western Colorado during the late summer is not merely hot, it is actively predatory. The high-altitude air, thin and incredibly dry, acts as an invisible vacuum, sucking every trace of moisture from the needles of the pines, the bark of the oaks, and the very soil beneath your feet. The wind blowing off the vast deserts to the southwest carries a static charge that makes the dry grass crackle underfoot like dry paper. To an experienced fire warden, the forest at this time of year does not feel like a living ecosystem. It feels like a vast, volatile bomb waiting for the single inevitable spark that will ignite its fuse. The mechanics of a wildland crown fire are a masterclass in thermodynamic violence. It is a phenomenon that defies the conventional understanding of fire. When a crown fire gathers strength driven by 50-mile-an-hour winds, it does not slowly consume the timber. Instead, the intense radiant heat of the approaching front preheats the canopy ahead, raising the temperature of the pine needles to their ignition point before the actual flames ever touch them. The volatile resins and terpenes inside the wood begin to boil, vaporizing into a highly combustible gas that hovers in the treetops. When the flame front finally arrives, the entire forest canopy does not catch fire. It explodes, leaping across valleys and ridges in giant roaring bounds, creating a convective column of superheated air that can pull mature trees out of the ground by their roots. It was this mechanical beast that was currently roaring down Croft Ridge toward the pristine glass and steel homes of Blackwood Glen. When Caleb Croft made his decision to bypass the granite wall, he was not merely choosing to destroy some trees, he was choosing to sacrifice a piece of his own soul. The Sedge Oak Grove was the heart of Pendleton Sanctuary. It was a magnificent historic stand of white oaks and deep green sedge grass planted in 1895 by his grandfather Silas Croft to celebrate his marriage and the permanent establishment of the homestead. These trees were not merely timber, they were a living ledger of his family's history on this land. They had survived this great drought of 1934, the brutal winters of the 50s, and the gradual encroachment of the modern world. Their massive, knotty trunks, some over 4 feet in diameter, stood as silent, deeply rooted guardians of the ridge, their canopy providing a cool, shadowed sanctuary where Caleb had played as a boy and sat in quiet reflection as an old man. Caleb climbed into the high steel cab of his 70-ton Caterpillar D8 bulldozer, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned operator. He threw the heavy glow plug switch, pumped the throttle, and hit the ignition. The massive 12-liter diesel engine roared to life with a brutal, earth-shaking rumble, a rebellious mechanical growl that echoed off the approaching wall of smoke. He engaged the heavy steel tracks, lowered the high-tensile steel blade, and steered the giant machine directly toward the edge of his beloved grove. The physical sensation of driving a bulldozer through a forest of your own ancestry is something that leaves a permanent scar on a man. As the massive blade slammed into the first 100-year-old white oak, Caleb felt the shockwave travel through the steel frame of the machine, vibrating up through his boots and directly into his chest. The ancient tree, which had stood for over a century, let out a horrific cracking scream of splintering wood, a deep, agonizing groan of fiber tearing under irresistible mechanical force. The canopy shuddered, and then the giant oak collapsed forward with a thunderous crash, its branches snapping like dry twigs as it was crushed into the dirt under the massive steel tracks of the D8. Caleb did not look back. He kept his eyes locked on the path ahead, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Tears of grief and physical exertion mingled with the sweat and soot on his face, but his hands remained steady on the control levers. He drove the bulldozer forward with relentless, brutal precision, carving a wide, raw swath of bare mineral soil through the very heart of his sanctuary. He felt every tree that fell, the ancient oaks, the young saplings he had planted with his own father, the deep mats of wild mountain herbs. Each one a sacrifice made to save the lives of the 4 young firefighters trapped on the other side of the granite wall. By the time he emerged on the other side of the grove, his beloved sanctuary was gone, replaced by a wide, muddy scar of raw earth. But he had carved a 12-foot-wide, perfectly flat fire break that bypassed the HOA's rock barrier, entirely offering a clear, unobstructed path to safety. When Engine 3 finally roared through the newly carved path, the heat from the approaching fire front was already so intense that the glossy red paint on the driver's side of the truck was bubbling and blistering into a charred black crust. The 4 young firefighters inside the cab looked out at Caleb as they passed, their eyes wide with a combination of terror and profound gratitude. They knew without a doubt that if Caleb had not sacrificed his family's heritage to open that path, their truck would have been overrun by the firestorm within 90 seconds. The morning after a wildfire is a silent, ghostly affair. The world is stripped of color, reduced to a monochrome landscape of stark whites, deep grays, and jet blacks. The air is cold, thick, with the heavy alkaline smell of wet ash and charred wood. Caleb Croft stood on the porch of his cabin looking out over the valley. His cabin was safe, protected by the wide fire break he had carved through his own land. But his beautiful historic oak grove was gone, replaced by a raw, muddy scar of bare earth. Down the ridge, the gated community of Blackwood Glen was a scene of devastation. 3 of the largest, most expensive mansions, including the grand residence of Priscilla Davenport, were completely gone. Only their concrete foundations and twisted metal steel beams remained, looking like the rib cages of giant prehistoric beasts rotting in the ash. A small group of men in dark corporate windbreakers walked slowly along the boundary line. They were the senior forensic investigators for Lloyd's of New York, the international underwriting firm that insured the multi-million-dollar estates of Blackwood Glen. They were accompanied by Chief Harris and a county fire investigator. Priscilla Davenport stood near them, wrapped in a cheap gray wool blanket provided by the Red Cross. Her hair was matted with soot, her eyes red and hollow. "It was a tragedy," Priscilla sobbed, her voice trembling as she addressed the lead investigator, a cold, sharp-eyed man named Miller. "A natural disaster. The fire was simply too fast. We expect the claim process to be expedited. We need to begin rebuilding immediately." Miller did not look up from his digital tablet. He adjusted his glasses, his face completely devoid of emotion. "Ma'am, we have completed our initial physical and document audit, and I'm afraid I have some very difficult news for you and the board." Priscilla blinked, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "Difficult? What do you mean? We have a $12 million comprehensive policy." "You did," Miller said, his voice flat, professional, and Tanya and ruthless. "But under Section 9, Clause 4 of your policy, the insurer is completely absolved of any liability for property damage if the insured party engaged in willful negligence or unauthorized modifications that directly obstructed standard emergency services or compromised municipal safety infrastructure." "Willful negligence!" Priscilla gasped, her voice rising to a shriek. "We did no such thing. We are a premium gated community. We spent $300,000 on safety. You dumped 250 tons of granite hawks on a designated Class 1 federal fire corridor," Miller said, pointing with his pen toward the rock wall, which was now blackened with soot, but still completely intact, blocking the pine needle trail. "And more importantly, you signed this." Miller pulled a laminated copy of the Croft Blackwood Joint Agreement of Aesthetic Compliance and Infrastructure Liability Waiver from his leather folder. "According to this document," Miller continued, Your HOA explicitly accepted 100% ownership, maintenance, and structural liability for this easement and the water line running beneath it. By dumping those rocks, you crushed the gravity main that supplied the very fire suppression system you claimed would protect the neighborhood. You then sued Mr. Croft to force him to open a broken line, and when the court ruled that you must move the rocks to repair it, you refused to do so. The court record is very clear, ma'am, the county fire investigator added, stepping forward. If that road had been clear, Engine 3 would have arrived 10 minutes earlier, connected to a pressurized water line, and easily saved all 3 houses. Instead, they were trapped, and they only survived because Mr. Croft destroyed his own valuable oak forest to carve an emergency escape route for them. Your rocks caused this destruction, ma'am, not the fire. This is absurd, Priscilla screamed, her face contorting with panic. I am the president of the HOA. The residents will sue you. They will sue the county. No, Priscilla. A cold, angry voice cut through the smoky air. A group of Blackwood Glen homeowners was walking up the path. They were wealthy, powerful people, surgeons, tech executives, and corporate lawyers, and they were absolutely furious. The insurance company isn't going to pay us, Priscilla. One of the homeowners, a tall man named Sterling, said, his voice trembling with rage. And because you signed that idiotic waiver without board approval or legal review just to feed your own petty ego, our personal insurance policies are void too. We are ruined, and we are going to hold you personally liable for every single penny of our losses. Priscilla's iPad slipped from her hand, crashing onto the blackened granite rocks below. Her diamonds suddenly felt very cold and very useless. 3 months later, the mountain winter had arrived. A fresh, thick blanket of white snow covered the valley, burying the scars of the fire under a clean, silent shroud. The Pine Needle Trail was open again. A crew of county workers, paid for by the court-ordered liquidation of Priscilla Davenport's personal assets, had spent 3 weeks removing every single granite stone from the fire lane. Caleb Croft stood on his porch holding a warm cup of coffee. He looked down at the trail. It was wide, clean, and clear, bordered by the stark, beautiful silhouettes of the surviving ponderosa pines. A brand-new heavy-duty fire engine from the county department drove slowly up the trail on a routine winter patrol. As it passed Caleb's cabin, the driver tapped the horn twice, a warm, respectful salute to the man who had sacrificed his own forest to save their brothers. Caleb raised his copper mug in a quiet return salute. Priscilla Davenport was gone. Her mansion was a fenced-off, snowy pit of concrete ruins, and she was currently living in a rented apartment in Denver, facing 3 separate class action lawsuits and a criminal investigation for reckless endangerment. The Blackwood Glen HOA had been permanently dissolved by a county court order. Caleb took a slow sip of his coffee. The mountain wind blew through the pines, carrying the clean, pure scent of snow and fresh pine needles. The elements had returned. The rules of vanity had been swept away like ash. And on Croft Ridge, the only things left standing were the laws of physics, the law of the land, and the quiet, unyielding forest. The true accounting of a disaster does not take place in the immediate aftermath, when the smoke still hangs in the air and the news cameras are rolling. It takes place weeks later in quiet, sterile offices through the meticulous, cold-blooded application of insurance forensics and contract law. The investigation into the destruction of Blackwood Glen was led by Miller, the senior forensic underwriter for Lloyd's of New York. Miller was a man who viewed the world through a lens of probability, risk mitigation, and mathematical certainty. He spent 3 weeks at the scene using high-resolution thermal imaging drones to map the exact path of the fire, analyzing the municipal water records and examining the fractured pieces of the clay-sealed water main that had been excavated from beneath the granite wall. Miller's final report was a masterpiece of cold professional destruction. He proved with absolute mathematical certainty that the failure of the fire suppression system was not an act of God, but a direct result of the HOA's willful negligence. The static load of the 250 tons of granite hocks had exceeded the structural capacity of the subsurface soil by over 300%, crushing the pipe beneath. The report included high-resolution satellite imagery showing the exact date the rocks were dumped, contrasted with the precise minute the water pressure in the primary line dropped to 0. Based on these findings, Lloyd's of New York formally issued a complete denial of claim under Section 9, Clause 4 of their master policy. This denial triggered a catastrophic financial domino effect that tore the community of Blackwood Glen apart far more effectively than the fire ever could. Under the HOA's own bylaws written by the developers to protect their own corporate interests, the individual homeowners were bound by a joint and several liability clause. Because Priscilla Davenport had signed the joint agreement of aesthetic compliance and infrastructure liability waiver, under the official HOA seal, her unilateral signature legally bound every single resident in the subdivision. The individual insurance companies of the homeowners, realizing that the HOA had formally accepted 100% of the liability for the infrastructure failure, immediately voided their own policies. The wealthy residents, the surgeons, the tech executives, the corporate lawyers who had once looked down on Caleb Croft from their glass terraces suddenly found themselves facing complete financial ruin. They were personally liable for the millions of dollars in damages to their own homes, the cost of the emergency response, and the massive civil claims filed by the county for the destruction of public property. A wave of bitter, vicious litigation erupted within the community. The residents, desperate to salvage whatever they could from the wreckage, turned on Priscilla Davenport with the fury of starved wolves. They filed a massive class-action lawsuit against her, personally alleging breach of fiduciary duty, gross negligence, and unauthorized execution of legal contracts. Priscilla's assets were immediately frozen by court order. Her bank accounts, her investment portfolios, her expensive jewelry, and her remaining properties were liquidated to satisfy the mounting legal judgments against her. She left the valley on a gray, rainy Tuesday in November, driving a rented U-Haul truck containing the few personal belongings she had been allowed to keep. There were no diamonds on her fingers, no cashmere wrap around her shoulders. She was completely broken, ruined by the very system of rules, aesthetic guidelines, and administrative arrogance she had used as a weapon against her neighbors. Down on the Pine Needle Trail, the snow began to fall, laying a thick, silent blanket of white over the scars of the ridge. The mountains, which had stood for millions of years before the first human ever laid claim to a single acre of land, began the slow, patient process of reclaiming the valley. The scorched foundations of the mansions were buried under the drifts, looking like nothing more than ancient, forgotten ruins. The laws of vanity had been swept away, leaving behind only the simple, unyielding truths of the land. On Croft Ridge, the only things left standing were the laws of physics, the law of the contract, and the quiet, unyielding forest waiting for the spring.